Hello and thank you for tuning into The New Orchard. Starting a school from the ground up in Australia requires navigating an extremely strict regulatory framework, securing serious funding, convincing parents, meeting accreditation standards, which may explain why few entrepreneurs attempt starting physical schools compared to entrepreneurs who dedicate their focus to so-called edtech, education technology, or educational services. The high capital investment, long-term commitment, and no immediate big financial gains deter many from even trying. But not my guest today though, but we'll get to him in a moment. I've decided to dedicate a portion of New Orchard's bandwidth to classical education as well as other non-mainstream modalities, not just because of my ongoing process of discovery, which feeds my curiosity, but more importantly, I wanted this show to have a small role in moving the needle towards a more diverse educational landscape in Australia by promoting and telling stories of people who are going out of their way, day in and day out, to make this more diverse landscape happen brick by brick. In classical education, physical brick-and-mortar settings hold quite a significant importance due to the pedagogical, cultural, and communal principles that define this educational philosophy. The idea is to try and incorporate architectural elements inspired by classical traditions such as columns, beautiful green courtyards, or art-filled halls to create an environment that elevates the soul and inspires deep contemplation. Such spaces reflect their tradition's belief that physical surroundings shape both character and thought. Unfortunately, in today's educational mainstream, this is something that has been very much relegated to the fringes of priorities, sadly, with only very few people standing firm and defending the old-tested principles. One such person is my guest today. Father Stephen David, head of St. John of Kronstadt Academy in Brisbane, Australia, a father of two, assistant priest at Holy Annunciation Orthodox Church, and a commercial lawyer, a man of many talents and deep dedication if I've ever seen one. The reason why I wanted to bring him on the show is very simple. Unlike many people who wanted and who have tried to start a new school and unfortunately failed, he has succeeded. How he succeeded and what lessons can others draw from his amazing story will be the focus of today's episode. Let's get inspired and dive into the conversation. Can you please take us back to your early years? What sort of environment were you raised in, intellectually, spiritually, culturally, and how did those environments shape your sense of self?
I'm the child of migrant parents. My parents are from Egypt and migrated out here into Australia in 1973, so they've been out here for quite a while. And being, part of a migrant family, you end up being part of a migrant community, and a lot of people probably wouldn't know, but the largest concentration of Christians in the Middle East is in Egypt, and that's the Coptic Orthodox community, and my family's Coptic Orthodox, and they still are till today, and so my parents are new to Australia, a country they've never been to, and don't really understand. And they get off the plane, and the second day they're working in a factory. My aunt was working at, and these were the 70s where you could do such a thing. But they came here to get a better life. Things in Egypt were getting harder and harder for Christians. They still are, and so they really came, as so many migrants do. They come out here to give their children a better future, and so that I grew up in a culturally Egyptian community, and that really centered on church life, especially because it's very common, of course, for migrants to congregate either around a club or the church or or the mosque, whatever it is, and so I was raised in the Coptic church, and I had some amazing people who taught me and influenced me throughout my life. The church has always been something that I've loved, and it's definitely shaped my view on what life is about and what the purpose of life is. And so that's the environment in which I grew up. I've got two other brothers. I'm the eldest of three, and we back at that time, my parents put us into Catholic schools because where else are they going to put us? And they wanted an education with some Christian foundation to it. And so we went to the local Catholic schools, and then I went through the Marist schools in Sydney for my high schooling, finished that, and all through that I was constantly involved in church life. So when you go at the church I was in, you went through Sunday school, as we called it, which is a bit of a remnant from a Protestant influence in Egypt, interestingly enough. And then once you finish year 12, they have these youth meetings, and it's just the next step up. And so you're constantly involved. And, the Coptic community they're amazing people, and they're just, every member of the Coptic church is kind of like your extended family in some respects. And that's a wonderful thing to be a part of. So I've always stayed close to the church. I had my forays into, going out and having a good time, and it just, for me, it just didn't do it. And so I got more involved in church service, and at the same time, I finished school. I actually started in computer engineering a long time ago, and I realised very quickly I was not going to be an engineer, and engineers are a particular type of person, and I then went into the law, and went and studied, finished my law qualifications, got admitted to practice law, and then through this I was working, and I would subsequently actually go on to do a master's degree at university in international law, which was very interesting, and then worked in various capacities in my legal profession. But in regard to your question about the early years, we were a conservative family, and we, having parents who were living in a country that they didn't necessarily understand meant that you're kind of cocooned from a lot of things, and so that's very much the kind of upbringing I had. But especially in the Coptic community, academics is really strongly pushed, very much like Indian communities and so forth. They push their getting top grades, getting into top university courses, preferably medicine or something, is a big objective.
And why is that?
Because, coming from a country like Egypt, it's your only way to succeed, right? And so, but also there's that whole, there's a social status that comes with doing well, right? Because, being honest, families would compare the results of their child to the other kids at church. Oh, your son got 92, my son got 98, and it's a social status thing. And also within the Egyptian community, being a doctor is the elite, And so it's a highly esteemed profession among that community.
I hope you don't mind if we deviate a little bit from the focus of today's episode. But can I ask you to explain what Coptic Christianity is? What is its flavour as well as origin? And how does it compare to something like Anglican denomination?
In the early church, the apostles, after the ascension of Christ and after Pentecost, they go out into the world and they start to evangelize. And one of the places that the evangelist Mark, who's one of the gospel writers, one of the places he goes to is Alexandria. And he begins to evangelize in Alexandria. This is, of course, for those who don't know, that sits on the Mediterranean Sea at the very north of coastline of Egypt. And what happens is that Christianity then begins to expand through the whole of Egypt. And Egypt at one point, a lot of people don't know, was predominantly a Christian country before the Arab invasions in the 600s. The Arab invasion, of course, changes everything. They outnumber the Christians, and then you have the systematic persecution, pretty much to this day, of the Christians. They become the minority because the Arabs come and, they each have 6, 7, 8 wives, and and they just they by sheer number. So that church that St. Mark establishes is the Coptic church. Coptic means Egypt. That's what the word means. So it's the Egyptian Orthodox Church. Now, in terms of your question, it's a little bit more complicated because, I'm a priest with the Russian Orthodox Church. I made the move to the Eastern Orthodox Church back in 2013, and but way before the Anglicans come along in the Reformation, you have a split. And what happens is it all comes to a discussion about how do we describe Christ, the natures of Christ. The Eastern Orthodox will say, well, Christ has two separate and distinct natures, being divine and human, and separate energies and separate wills, and that the two don't mix. The Coptic Church, and they're part of what's called the Oriental family in the Orthodoxy. Oriental Orthodox, and then you've got the Eastern Orthodox. By the way, Oriental just means Eastern, but it's just a way of distinguishing between the two groups. There's a division within the Orthodox Church, and the Orientals argue, well, he has one nature, and they're going back to the writings of someone called Saint Cyril, who was before the First Ecumenical Council, who uses this term one nature. So the argument is that, and this is oversimplified, by the way, but it's that he's both fully God, fully man, but in the one nature of Christ, whereas the Eastern Orthodox say two. That's what's called, they become known as the monophysites or the miaphysites because of that. And you have a split because the Eastern Orthodox Church say, well, no, that's not correct. The Orientals say, well, we think that our view is correct. And then you have this split. So in terms of the Anglicans, they won't come along until the Reformation, until the 1600s. So this is, we're talking, this all happens, during the early centuries. So this comes way before, even way before 1054, when you have a split between the East and West, between Rome and the rest of the Orthodox churches. But what's interesting is in Egypt is that despite the fact the Copts are the largest group, they have their own patriarch. But the Eastern Orthodox Church has a presence in their. They've got their own Pope in Alexandria, but who doesn't have the numbers. The vast majority of Christians are Coptic Orthodox, and it's more that the Eastern Orthodox wanted a presence in, because you had these major cities when the early church started, and Alexandria, along with Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome. These are the major cities. These are the major centres of Christianity. And so the Eastern Orthodox Church wants to maintain some control in that space, but the Orientals are pretty much doing their own thing. So with the question of the distinction between the Anglicans, you've got the split within Orthodoxy, you've got the split then away from Rome, and then you have the Reformation, which then brings another split. You have Martin Luther and the flow on from that. It's what I suppose makes it difficult when you're looking at, between the Eastern and the Orientals, there's not a lot of points of difference. It then gets, that distinction in theology gets larger when you look at the West, Rome in particular, especially after, I think it was like maybe the 16th century or a bit later even, when Rome is going to start putting forward these principles of universal jurisdiction. The Pope of Rome is the bishop of all the churches, over everybody, and this has never been the foundation of the church. And then when the Reformation comes, that split is even larger, because they choose to then jettison and a lot of the tradition of the church as was held up until that point. Martin Luther, of course, is disgusted by the indulgences within the Roman Catholic Church and all the corruption. But he then starts to reject a whole lot of other things, and it becomes his movement becomes a very different church. But the Orthodox Church is essentially the church that has been established by the apostles, that remains continuing until today. The Protestants would not argue with that, because they only come along in the 16th century, and they're fairly new on the scene. That wouldn't be a claim that they would make. But whether it's the Eastern or the Orientals, these are the oldest churches in the world. They maintain the traditions of the apostles, and they have what's called apostolic succession, and they can trace the bishops receive the blessing that goes all the way back to the apostles, and so there's that link to the very early church.
That's super interesting. Thank you for that. I would like to get back to your origin story, if I may. You've already mentioned that your educational journey was somewhat experimental. You've dipped your toes into a few different things, and some of those things did not seem right to you, which made you pivot into something else a few times. Can you tell me how this experimental nature of your education influenced you, how you think about truth, purpose, and responsibility today?
The problem with the education that I got, and it was just the mainstream, run-of-the-mill, vanilla Catholic education, it really never engaged any of those things. It wouldn't be really until I went to study law that you start to actually engage with some of those issues in some meaningful way. Especially when you're looking at jurisprudence and the development of law and those sorts of things. But it wasn't, my education was not focused on the pursuit of, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it was just, it just really felt like was just, we have to get through this bit of work, and then you do an exam, and see how much you can remember. And I went to a school where sports was far more esteemed than your academics. It was that type of place, and so and it wasn't like the place where, see, in order to engage with truth and those sorts of issues, you really need to read philosophy, and you really need to read the great books. And I didn't get any of those. The closest, I shouldn't say the closest. That this is not correct. I remember in year 11 being given a book by Tim Winton. Look, I'm not a fan, I have to say, but I know a lot of people are. But we really never engaged with anything that actually even kind of addressed those deeper issues. But through my, when looking at truth, of course, my religious upbringing, of course, was a far greater influence, especially scripture, tradition, and how we were taught to live our Christian Orthodox life. So unfortunately, the education I got, really did not help me in those things. And it wouldn't be until later in life that, much later in life that I'd be reading, books like The Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, or The Iliad, or philosophers like Plato's Republic, those sorts of things, and really engaging with those deeper questions. What is truth? How do you, I don't want to say critique, how do you form a way of thinking that helps you to understand the truth? So yes, I hope that makes some sense.
It does make a lot of sense to me, because I have followed a path that's not too dissimilar to yours. I do wonder sometimes what Dostoevsky would taste like had I read him at 16 or 17. Truth is, I only started reading him at 35, at least reading him properly with attention and focus.
It wasn't that long ago that I read Crime and Punishment for the first time, and there are parts of that I think it's a brilliant, brilliant book. I read Brothers Karamazov, and I still don't know what to make of it, I have to say. But Crime and Punishment, there's just some parts, there's dialogue that goes on in there. Like, the minute I finished reading Crime and Punishment, I automatically wanted to go back to page 1 and start reading again. It's a brilliant piece of work. Dostoevsky's very good, very good.
I think Russian authors are maybe a little bit underappreciated in our culture. Tolstoy, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, or somebody like Solzhenitsyn are all quite incredible. I recently read, I think for the 4th time, Solzhenitsyn's Warning to the West. It's such a short but so incredibly potent piece of work. I mean, the story goes that it's the hardships of living in Russia that has created all these fantastic writers.
No, I think that's true. My wife is Russian, and she grew up in USSR, right? And they grew up in hard times. Like, there's stories of, going to the shop and there's nothing on the shelf to buy, even if you do have some money to buy, and sometimes there's just no food there, and everything was hard, and then if you look at the Gulag archipelago, which he memorized the whole thing. But I think that the hardship, a hardship, I think, helps a person to understand reality far more. And they understand what it's, we here in Australia, life is just too good, but that's not necessarily a reflection of reality. But you have to look at the history of Russia to really comprehend, because everyone thinks of the Bolshevik Revolution and everything else. It was interesting because I was just been listening to another podcast where, they were making the point, you got to go all the way back to Peter the Great and the House of Romanov. I mean, things were already tough from back then. And so and then the Bolshevik Revolution is just a continuation. So it's serious hardship. The estimates are 70 million.
Death at unimaginable scales has been a permanent fixture of Russian nation. I think one thing we don't seem to understand well here in the West is that Russians swim in an ocean of intergenerational trauma, brutally invaded multiple times by French, the Nazis, and the Mongols. I think their contemporary generation is deeply connected to that trauma. I don't want us to talk politics today, but very briefly, I do think it's a mistake that the West does not want to pull Russia into some kind of a common sphere of collaboration. Anyway, let's get back on track here. You began your professional life as a commercial lawyer. What drew you to that path initially, and what were you hoping to find or achieve within it?
The law was kind of far more attractive to me because I was a reader. I love to read, and that was, I played to my strengths, and so it was just, I've always found the law to be interesting, and so I thought, I'd go into law, and even when I got the offer to do engineering, but I actually wanted to do law, but the offer was there, and I thought, okay. But if I'm being completely honest, that I finished school when I was 17, and I don't know what a 17-year-old's supposed to know what to do with his life. I was pretty confused. So I went to do that because, as I said, I love reading and I love to write, and it just seemed like an obvious move. Good, stable job. Again, this is carping back to my, my upbringing. You've got to get a good job, stable job, so that you can set yourself up and have a family one day and those sorts of things. And so it appealed to me for all those reasons. I don't know. I wasn't really wasn't going into it for to change the world and that sort of thing. But it appealed to me as a job that I would probably enjoy. But the reality, though, was pretty different. Law firms are like massive factories, and you've got to do your billable hours, and you've got to make as much profit. That's what law firms are all about at the end of the day. And so that was probably one of the reasons why I moved into the public service and lived in Canberra for 12 years, working for the Commonwealth Government, because, well, this isn't all about billable hours. This is about, working for the public and doing something, hopefully, that's worthwhile.
Did practicing law teach you anything about human nature? I mean, beyond greed and profit accumulation, and as you've mentioned, time cheating, billable hours, were there any lessons about human nature at all that you can talk to us about?
There was a period of time where I actually did some work for the New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions, so in criminal law. And that was an eye-opener because, you got to see some of the worst things possible. And but I think one of the saddest things was, you'd have let's just say a young man who's being sentenced for something, and what would generally happen is at sentencing they would provide a report on the person's life, and also, a list of previous offences, blah, blah, blah. And quite often, this person had been in and out of jails and had been in trouble with the police since their teens. And it was just a revolving kind of door in and out. And you could just see that there's just very little hope of breaking that cycle. And that's quite sad in a lot of ways. But also, the immense greed of people. Not only in the criminal space, and I remember prosecuting a matter, and it was a murder case, and the person was alleged to have murdered his first cousin, because he believed that he was not passing on drugs that he was having sent through his cousin, and just things that you can't even. You don't want to actually acknowledge the fact that these things do happen, but they do happen, and but the immense greed, but also in the commercial space and so forth. The drive to make money, and really that is a big driver for a lot of people, and I can understand people wanting to make money, but you got to remember, when you're practicing law, sometimes you're at the worst end of things. Do you know what I mean? You don't necessarily you're not seeing necessarily the best of people, which is one of the reasons I never practiced family law, because it's just a very emotionally driven area, very emotional. Commercial law is, we negotiate terms, or if there's a dispute, we argue it out as to what our interpretation is and how we think you've done the wrong thing. But in family law, you've got two people who at one point thought they were very much in love with each other, who now, for the most part, are just absolute enemies. And it's very, very sad to see. So,
going into law is a massive investment. One has to put both a lot of money and a lot of effort when becoming a lawyer, and despite that, you've decided to leave. Was there one specific moment where you thought to yourself, I no longer want to do this? Or was it a longer, more gradual phase out over a year or two? How did that play out for you?
Working in an office where you're doing long hours, trying to, make your targets and all the rest of it. I don't know. For me, I just could not understand the purpose. For me, it just didn't seem that there was a purpose to that. And for me, I need to do work that's meaningful, that I feel that I get a sense of meaning out of. And it was a gradual process. So I worked for an accounting firm for a short period of time, one of the large ones, and it was the type of place where they wanted you to eat, sleep, breathe the firm. And this was back in the late 90s, and the competition between the big accounting firms was huge. But for me, life is not work. There is something more important than simply working. And I did not want to, have to do ridiculous hours just to move up the corporate ladder. That to me was just not appealing. Being a partner in a firm was just not a driver for me. And so, I as I said, I moved to at one point I actually started a PhD, and I thought of possibly getting into academia. And then that kind of phased out, and then I moved to Canberra to work in the public service. But again, the public service, it's a very slow-moving machine, and it's not very well known to be very productive, is the way I'd put it. And so, after a while, I realised, well, this is kind of, sure, I'm not doing the billable hours, but it's not anymore as meaningful as certainly as I'd hoped for.
Eventually, the path you chose was priesthood in the Orthodox Church. You've already given us a fair amount of information about your background, but let's maybe dive a little bit deeper into why religion and why orthodoxy in particular, in a time when tradition is often dismissed.
So, yeah, I probably have to just correct something there, and that is, I didn't. It's not that I decided to become a priest. I was not pursuing the priesthood at all. In the Orthodox Church, you get approached. Generally, if someone's pursuing it, they're probably not going to be ordained. But what happened was that in the parish that I was in, I was serving and trying to do the best I could, and in the way I could, and I was asked at one point if I would consider becoming a deacon in the church, which is it's part of the clergy, but it's a step down from the priest. And spoke to my wife because need her permission. That's how it works. And accepted. And then I spent 2 years as a deacon, and then I was asked, would I consider the priesthood? And again, spoke to my wife, and I felt if I'm being asked to serve, then I will serve. And in terms of why orthodoxy, well, I'm what you call cradle Orthodox. I've always been in the Orthodox Church, but I do believe that the fullness of the faith is contained in the Orthodox Church. And so what we would say is, for example, we were talking about the Reformation and the Protestants a bit earlier. We wouldn't deny that they know who God is and they know who Jesus is, but we would say that their understanding of the faith is nowhere near as deep, because they've gotten rid of so much of the teachings and the tradition of the church. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, which has maintained the apostolic teachings, the fullness of the church is contained in that. And I love the Orthodox Church. I love the services. That is where I find the liturgy is the peak of our liturgical practices. There is nothing greater than the liturgy. In fact, the saint that we named the school after prayed liturgy every single morning, every day for the last 38 years of his life. And he has a saying, he said, when I'm not in liturgy, I die. And that is, the experience of the liturgy is very unique, because time effectively stops. And it's, and so, I wouldn't have considered anything else, because for me, that is, as I said, where the fullness of the faith is revealed and contained.
Interesting. That makes a whole lot of sense. In quiet moments of priesthood, in confession, in teaching, in liturgy, what have you learned about what people are really searching for today? A lot of people seem to be quite lost in this chaotic world of ours.
Let me answer that question by telling you what's happening in Orthodoxy today. And let me step back to the COVID years. Throughout COVID, our parish grew exponentially. And maybe there's a number of factors and to that. And it could be in part that people were thinking about their mortality and thinking about the meaning of life. But ever since that time, the church has... we're the only English-speaking parish in Brisbane. The other Orthodox parishes pray in what's, in their own traditional languages like Church Slavonic, that sort of thing. But we only pray in English. And so we're the obvious place for people who are interested in Orthodoxy to come to. And I think my view is this, Patrick, that the more crazy the world becomes, the more people are looking for a rock and a foundation. And I think people are actually far more inherently conservative than they think they are. There's some things now that, even if you're liberally minded, you kind of go, that's just going too far. And then they're starting to question everything. And that's precisely what we're seeing. Every single Sunday we see a new face at church. Every single Sunday. Our church has expanded and grown. I was in Toowoomba today, and we have a parish in Toowoomba. Again, the priest up there is seeing just huge growth. And so, again, the more and more unstable the world becomes, I think the desire for finding meaning, but also finding a foundation for people is becoming even stronger. And I think that then drives them to think, okay, well, maybe religion has an answer. And I've heard this many a time. They'll try different things, even within the Christian umbrella. And yet we have a lot of people who will come to the Orthodox Church and say, this is where I feel at home. Especially if, for example, they start reading some church history and then they discover online, because people are reading online everything now. It's incredible. And they begin to read about the Apostolic Church. They begin to understand that Orthodox Church is the continuing tradition of the apostles. And so they then look to that. But, people come from all sorts of walks and all sorts of backgrounds. Sometimes they're atheists, but something changes within them, and they say, no, I need to rethink the whole purpose of everything. And so, and people, they want to find a loving God. Because how do you deal with sin? Psychotherapy is not going to fix it. And we're all fallen and we all fall short. And so, but the church has the answer to that, and that is, for example, it's confession and the absolution and then communion. And see, unlike the West, and unlike the Protestants, the Calvinists, for example, who will preach what's called penal substitutionary atonement, there's this theory that God's angry because man sinned, and therefore Jesus has to pay that back and pay that debt to God because he's angry. And then that fixes everything, that reconciles everything. Again, that's too oversimplified. In Orthodoxy, that's not the view at all. It's God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He sends his Son into the world because he loves the world and he loves mankind who is made in his image and likeness. He sends him into the world to die for the world, to reconcile man with God. It's out of love. There's nothing there scripturally that can support the notion that God is angry and has to be appeased. It is all out of love. And that verse I just quoted, that's directly from the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten, not because he was angry. And when it's understood that way, then that's a God that a lot of people can accept. I don't want a God who's angry and wanting to strike me down. Of course not. And so, we live in a time where we've never been so, affluent. We've never, like, I can jump onto Amazon tomorrow and order whatever I like, and I can have everything. Really, everything's at my disposal. But people are realizing that none of that satisfies. It just, I can have all the goods. I'm still not happy. And the church offers the solution to that. And it is only in Christ that we find our fulfillment. And so I think a lot of people are kind of just sick of, okay, we just accumulate lots of stuff and, go on holidays and all the rest of it, and I still don't feel any better. It doesn't make me feel any more fulfilled.
Somebody once told me that the Orthodox Church expects most from its followers. Is that true?
I would say yes.
And how's that manifested?
Well, it expects the most. I suppose I don't really understand. I don't know the context from where that came from. But if I'm interpreting it correctly, spiritually, yes. So what I mean by that is, our liturgy is 8:30 to 2 hours long. Vigil service on a Saturday evening is 2.5 hours long, or a bit less. Over 260 days of the year are fasting days, because every Wednesday and Friday are fasting days. When I say fasting, most people think of Islamic fasting. It's not that. It's that we just refrain from certain foods. But every Wednesday is the day that Judas betrays Jesus, and every Friday is the day of the crucifixion. And because of those two occasions, those days are fasting days, because we remember. If you want to go and have communion, you need to be regularly going to confession. And then, of course, there's there's expectation. That's the external. Then we have the internal spiritual life, and there's morning and evening prayers that we're supposed to do. I've got to be reading my Bible. That is, the Bible is the Word of God, and spiritual books, and then not. So before Easter, which we call Pascha in the Eastern Church, which means Passover, there's 50 plus days of fasting, what we call strict fasting. No meat, no dairy, no poultry, no seafood. So you end up eating a lot of peanut butter. And but then, the first week of that period, we're in church every single evening. And then Holy Week is the week that leads up to Easter, Pascha. I think it's 15 services in 10 days. So, yes, I would say much is expected, but that's actually one of the things that we keep hearing from people who convert to Orthodoxy saying. They said, the church I used to go to, because we have a lot of converts from other churches, Protestant churches, they didn't expect anything of me. And in the Orthodox Church, there's something expected. I have to take responsibility for what I do. So yeah, in that respect, yes, if that's what's meant by it, then yeah, I would agree. But then I think so much more is gained, because you could look at all of that and just say that just sounds tiring and all the rest of it. But it's all very spiritually fulfilling if it's done correctly. And what we say about the liturgy, for example, is that you step out of the world and into heaven, because it's a replication of what Saint John the theologian sees in the Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible. And it's an amazing. The liturgy is an amazing experience, because it starts all the way from the birth of Christ all the way to his ascension, and it takes you through that journey, and it's spiritually very rich. We do not do things just for the sake of tradition. Everything has a spiritual meaning. Now, people may not understand that spiritual meaning. It doesn't mean that there isn't a spiritual meaning. It's just that they just don't understand it. But yes, the services are, I always say to people, this is the importance of doing it in English. Listen to the prayers, listen to the Psalms, listen to the hymnology. The hymnology is designed to teach us the faith. And if you listen to everything, you'll basically have a theology degree because you will have learnt so much. So it's an amazing experience.
It is very beautiful indeed. Let us pivot a little bit and talk about the Academy. The Academy began, in part, as a response to the birth of your daughter. What was it about that experience that awakened your concern with modern education?
I was not that passionate about education before, I was going to become a father. But when you become a parent, you start to think about different things. And one of the things I had been thinking about was, well, do I want her to get the education the same type of education that I got? And I went, no. After 12 years, I can't say that I actually was very educated by the end of it. Far from it. And so, this is one of the things I was thinking, because educating a child is a huge investment, and you only get to do it once. And you were talking a bit before about, things in the world being very unstable and all the rest of it. And that's the type of world my daughter's going to be born into. How do I give her the best chance of going into that type of a world? And I don't know what it's going to be like. She's 8 right now. I don't know what it's going to be like when she graduates from school. At the pace at which everything is progressing, I don't even want to consider it, because it's a scary thought. But then I really started to think about, well, I'm going to talk openly here. Public schools were out, and especially with the particular programs and agendas being pushed through education, Catholic schools are really not much better. They just got nicer uniforms and some nicer values. I've heard Catholic teachers actually say it's just public school with nicer uniforms. And unfortunately, I think the Catholic education system has lost its purpose, and it's very sad. But even when I had a look at even the big expensive schools, the problem is fundamentally the curriculum and the approach to education. And remember how I was talking about being in an ethnic group that was focused on results. I think that actually had a big impact on me because I don't subscribe to that approach. It's not about a score that you get at the end of some tests that determines your value as a person. But that's what it's become. And I didn't want my daughter in that environment either. And so, I started looking at, well, what are the options? And that's when, at the time, I started looking internationally. And for example, countries like Finland continue to top the charts in terms of performance in education. It was interesting that a UN study in 2015 that ranked 41 countries, including Australia, across a number of key areas. One of them was quality of education, and Australia ranked 39th out of 41 countries. And I just looked at all of that, and to be honest, I thought, well, our only option is going to be to pick up and move. And then providentially, that's when someone from my church gave me a copy of a book that he had read called The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher. He's a journalist in the US. He's also an Orthodox Christian. And there was a chapter in there about this thing called classical education. And if I take a step back, I wanted my daughter to be well-read, and I wanted her to be able to think, and I wanted these kinds of values for her. But I didn't feel that, that the Australian curriculum or Australian education was geared towards that. It's all geared towards a career, and that's it. Get the good marks, get into the good job, and also I didn't want her thinking that life is just consumeristic. And I really feel that that's become the objective. And so I read this chapter on classical education. I went, what is this? And just I went down down the rabbit hole and almost to the center of the earth. And I then started reading everything I could. And this is just something that, in Australia, we've just never, ever, it's never been raised. No one knows, actually. They know very little about the history of education. You've got to read people like, I think it's John Taylor Gatto, who wrote an excellent book on the history of education, going all the way back to Prussia. And I just read about this form of education that was begun by the ancient Greeks and Romans, lasted for over 2,000 years, only disappeared in the 20th century, and was focused on the cultivation of the person so that they could be a good member of society. And what were their objectives? Wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. This is in the classical space. And it had education for over 2,000 years had nothing to do with a career. Right? You go off and decide what you want, but you form the person first, and then they decide what they want to do with their life. And that's when the whole world of classical education just opened up. Of course, I looked around Australia, no classical schools, or some that had some liberal arts bents, but nothing locally on offer. The option was, of course, in the States, in the US, the resurgence of classical education had been ongoing since the early 1980s with a guy called Douglas Wilson, where they opened up a classical school in Moscow, Idaho. Since that time to now, if you fast forward, there's over 1,500 classical schools across the US. And it's just growing and growing. And their students, I don't want to harp on about test scores because I'm not a fan of that, but the students out of classical schools are some of the best and the brightest. They average, on average, they sit in the top 10 to 15% of the SATs. But when you look at, if we think that public education in Australia is not great, it's even poorer in the US. But also they're being chased by some of the best universities and colleges because these are students who are well-read. They can think, they can write. Our students in Australia, over the last 4 decades, Australian students have been sliding back in terms of reading, writing and arithmetic, decade after decade after decade. And no government has a solution for this, other than to throw money at the problem in the hope that if you give the teachers more resources, hopefully that will fix the problem. And that's not, it hasn't succeeded. The fundamental problem is that we've lost our purpose in education completely. It's just about, job preparation. There's no moral foundation to it. Students are graduating nihilistic and narcissistic. They don't have a purpose. They're nihilistic, and it's all about them. And so, I wanted something much better for my children. So, we could have picked up and gone to the US. That would have been an easy solution. I have no desire to live in the US, I have to say. But Australia's a great country. But or the other solution was that we opened up a school and offered it to more families. And so, as crazy an idea as that sounds, that's, by the grace of God, that's what we did.
That is a very solid set of motivations that you've just presented. Many schools claim to form the whole person. What makes a truly classical Orthodox education different, and why do you think it is so necessary in this day and age?
So, in terms of the first part, there's a great book called Desiring the Kingdom. I think it's G.K. Smith, but he says something in there that's really fundamentally important, and he says, every pedagogy assumes an anthropology. So every approach to education has to make certain assumptions about what that child is. Even if you're a diehard atheist, you have to make some judgment calls about what is that thing that's sitting in front of you. And you've then got to educate based on those assumptions. When schools say they try to teach for the whole person, the problem with that is modern progressive education. One of the fathers of modern progressive education was John Dewey, and he didn't believe that humans had a soul, for example. And so, from an Orthodox perspective, we go back to Scripture. Man is made in the very image and likeness of God, and he is made of mind, body, and soul, not just the mind. And so when you're trying to educate the whole person, you have to educate all those parts, not just the mind. The body has to be trained. In fact, the body in many ways comes before the mind. If you can't discipline the body, you cannot discipline the soul. That's why we fast in the Orthodox Church. It's so that we can control the passions, not just so that we can be, I can be vegan for 40 days. There are non-Christians who do that every day of the year. It's got a much deeper purpose. And, at the academy, in ancient Greece, they would train the body because they knew that was how you trained the heart and the mind. And so for us, everything we teach has to address those things. And you have to cultivate the body. You have to cultivate the soul through what we read and our prayer life. We pray liturgy every week with the students. Pray every morning and afternoon. We read the lives of the saints. We read classical great literature that conveys, classical education is an education in virtue. And that comes through what we read. But also it comes through other things. But a lot of it comes through what we read. It's not just a values-based system. Values it's just in the abstract is meaningless. But also the mind, and this comes into your the next part of your question. It's not simply about putting data into the child's mind and getting them to regurgitate it in an exam. It's being able to think, and in terms of the second part of your question, why is it so important to be stepping into this? As if civilization has any hope of not completely falling apart, we need wise, virtuous, eloquent people in the world, and who can think. And like, for example, in classical education, we teach in high school, you teach formal logic. The ability, and as a lawyer, this comes naturally because you have to be able to work through a legal argument systematically and logically to be able to make your case. And so, this is essential. You jump on TV now and you watch a debate between two people. The art of logic has just gone, no, you just can't find people, even at the political level. It's just, it's so poor. It's so bad. But, being able to have a civilized discussion and a debate and a dialogue where you can put forward your views, critique the other person's responses, and explain why you think they're wrong. And that's just sorely, sorely lacking in the public discourse today. But also, we want wise, virtuous, and eloquent people who are going to be the next fathers and mothers, and the next set of parents, or the next politicians, the next clergy. So much rides on us getting education right. It is not about a job. I would say this, the state of things at the moment, I believe strongly, is as a result of the decline in education. Unfortunately, yeah.
I wonder if you can offer a hypothesis for what is happening with parents, specifically why most parents are so quick to send their children down an educational path that has failed them. And maybe we should very briefly qualify what I mean by fail. If you take an average adult who has gone through standard public education, a few hundred hours of geography, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on, and then you start asking some basic questions about, let's say, what river runs through this or that country, or ask some foundational questions about gravity or function of mitochondria and so on. I'd say majority of people would not be able to provide answers to these basic questions, yet the same people are so incredibly quick, as I've said before, to send their children through the same system and create the same outcome. And just a quick caveat before I let you answer, this is not an attack on parents for behaving this way. In this economy of ours that's configured in the most insane way, most people have to scramble from one thing to another, so I totally appreciate that. Most don't have time to stop and deeply think about these issues. I totally get that. Now, you have briefly touched on this, explaining that the system we were running for the last few decades, if not a century, has led to this current paradigm. Do you think there's any hope to reverse this trend?
I really don't know. It would require a massive rethink by those who draft the curriculum. But I think the more pressing issue is how society now views education. And so the point you made, a lot of parents are disengaged, right? One of the answers to your question, why do they put them through the same system? It's because it's legislated. Legally, you must send your child to school, or you homeschool them. And most parents do not have the interest or the inclination to want to homeschool. But it's a legal requirement. You have to send your kids to school. So there's really no option there. But I think there's a couple of things happening. You've got the breakdown of the family. Mum and dad, a lot of families, mum and dad are busy working, right? And they've got their own careers, and they just don't have the time or the energy to invest in looking at the education of their children. But it's also just easier to pay the school to do that. And unfortunately, it's kind of like, school is just glorified daycare. They have to be there anyway. So, but, as long as I pay the fees, someone else will educate my children. And look, as long as they get out and they have a relatively good job, then they'll be fine. But see, Australia in particular, I'll say something slightly controversial, and that is that migrant children quite often will outperform the vast body of Australian students. And that's because they've come from cultures where they have to work really hard to compete against many other people who want their position. We live in too prosperous a country where there's not a lot of motivation, right? Because, hey, if I can go on Centrelink, or there's other avenues, and so you don't have that kind of motivation behind you to have to really excel. Whereas like immigrant families like mine, it's you came here for the purpose of doing better, and so you're going to do it. And you know how hard it is. But I just think, and I've not turned my mind to this question, but I do know that most parents on the whole are disengaged from the education system. Having said that, what's interesting is what's been, I think, very good for the move to classical education, because there is a movement here in Australia now, and it's growing, is COVID. Because for the first time, parents began to see directly into their children's classrooms. And quite a lot of parents were just not happy with what they were seeing. And they were saying, wait a minute, I expected something more, and they're not getting it. And so some parents, it's, we've seen a rise in homeschooling. The independent school sector for example, in Queensland is growing. And that's because, parents and religious groups are taking education into their own hands rather than delegating the responsibility out to other people. So, that's the best I can do. I think it's a really tough question, but I think also the disengagement comes back to the fact that education is just not valued.
You've started a school from scratch, which is absolutely amazing. There will be people in the audience listening to this and being very interested in how something like this can be done, especially in a centralized and highly, highly regulated environment. Can you tell us what were the biggest moments of fear or failure, and what gave you the courage to keep going despite endless challenges and roadblocks?
Starting a school is a monumental task, and there's a number of things that you have to get through, and it varies from state to state because education is a state and territory matter. It's not, we get Commonwealth funding, but it's not a Commonwealth responsibility. The requirements from state to state vary also. The first thing is the accreditation. So you have to be accredited with whatever accrediting body there is in your state. One of the fears I had certainly was we put our application in on the clear basis that we were going to be a classical school. Now that we have to meet the outcomes of the Australian curriculum. You don't have a choice in that. Every school must meet the outcomes of the Australian curriculum. But we were very open about the fact that our pedagogy and our approach was going to be very different. And being the first, classical Orthodox school in the country, I just wasn't sure how the authorities would take to that, And so that was, it could have easily, they could have just said, no, don't like this. I mean, I'd heard stories about it in other states, but I think it was just the way it was approached was not, was different. So that was a big thing. And not only were we accredited once, but we were accredited twice because we had to change sites. One of the other challenges we had was finding an appropriate site. And if you don't have millions of dollars in your back pocket to go and build something, or you don't have a spare building on hand, you have to find a site. And we had, in 2023, we opened in 2024, we had spent quite a long time negotiating the lease of a site, which is quite large, had quite a bit of space. Those negotiations broke down, and we had to withdraw because it was just too risky. And it was not. We did not get the lease. We found a place, but we did not get the lease signed until the 24th of November, and we were opening on the 22nd of January. Yep. So we just had to get in there, and by the grace of God, we had a big group of guys from my church actually, and people we knew who just came in, rolled up their sleeves, and we did everything, and did all the fit out and got it all ready, and so it came. We were still doing bits and pieces on the 21st to get it ready for opening, and there wasn't even a guarantee that we'd get the lease signed in time because the owners were overseas. They lived in Taiwan, and and we just couldn't get anything out of them. So we told the authorities we were opening on the 22nd of January, and we still didn't. We didn't have a site, and then of course, one of the biggest challenges is enrolments. When you're a brand new school and you don't have any track record, you're asking families to trust you. And we're up against very established schools. It's very easy for parents to go with the established school because it's there, you know it's working, and you know it's going to be there in 12 months' time. And even the financial aspect, in our first year, we didn't know we could entirely get through the year. But by the grace of God, we did. But again, trying to get enrollments and trying to get, in the lead up through 2022 and 2023, I was travelling everywhere, even in Victoria, giving presentations on what is classical education and why it's so important that we establish classical schools. And so that, we started with 12 students, but that was it was a lot of hard work, just to give the assurance to the families that it's they should trust us with their children.
Who were your first students, and how did you manage to convince parents that this is a good idea and that they should trust you?
The first two children that enrolled were my children, so they were the guinea pigs. They were all from. So we are what's called a pan-Orthodox school. So we have students from the Russian Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox, the Antiochian Orthodox. We now have a family that's Romanian Orthodox. We have one family that's non-Orthodox, and they have a couple of children in there. But yes, from that, from our churches and from that broader Orthodox community, yes.
The name of your school is St. John of Kronstadt Academy. How did you come up with that name?
St. John of Kronstadt is a relatively modern saint. If I'm not mistaken, I think he passed away in 1908, before the Bolshevik Revolution. And he's got a very interesting story, that he came at a time when the church was not in a great state. He was ordained to a church in Kronstadt, which is at that time was a naval city, a naval town. So not a good place. Lots of alcohol, lots of prostitution, you name it. That was the type of place it was at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. St. John was married, but he and his wife lived as brother and sister, and he was dedicated to the priesthood. But he was a teacher at the Kronstadt High School for 32 years, and he was very, very involved in education, and cared very much about the education of young people. And so he's a saint that I love, especially because he was a parish priest. I'm a parish priest, but extremely holy. He was made a saint outside of Russia before he was made a saint in Russia, but that's because of political reasons as well. But he's a modern saint. He was involved in education, and for all those reasons, I thought he would be a very good example and a good patron for the academy.
Looking ahead 10 to 20 years, what is your vision for the academy's role, not just in Brisbane, but in Australia and maybe even beyond?
I've never really thought about the academy beyond just the school that we have, not even outside of Australia, but in terms of the vision for the school. We want to grow. We want to build our own campus, and we want to build a really classically designed campus. Even in the place we're leasing, We've gone to a lot of effort to make it beautiful. There's beautiful framed artworks all around the place. We don't have technology in our classrooms. We don't have big screen TVs and iPads and all the rest of it. We have books, beautiful books beautiful bookshelves, that old antique bookshelves that we picked off of, Facebook Marketplace, places like that. And so the idea is to build a campus that will be beautiful, classically focused, that will support our objectives and our aims. And one of those things, for example, in my head, is that the building would be very much like a monastic building. It would be all part of one building, so that all the student body would all be part of one, and there's no separation. And that, we would then move all the way. Our aim is to go all the way through to year 12. We're currently up to grade 4. We're adding a grade each year. So next year, 2026, will be grade 5, all the way through to year 12. And also, one of the big things that I'm really quite passionate about is building a very, very sizable library. I was just saying to a school I was visiting today that we're on a bit of a mission to save books. Everything's going online, and my concern is that books are slowly just disappearing. And so our aim is to save books, and to be able to provide, beautiful library facilities where there's, that enriches and helps to preserve that heritage into the future. And so, but certainly, I've not turned my mind to anything beyond, because the other thing is to, as I mentioned, education is a state and territory matter. So if you go into New South Wales, there are different criteria, not dramatically different, but you can't just go and replicate a school in another state or territory. You have to actually meet a whole lot of, like in Victoria, the requirements are quite different, and they'll be different in South Australia. So for now, our focus is on becoming the leading and the very best classical school that we can possibly achieve. That's not easy within the framework of the Australian curriculum, and also within the framework of education in Australia. Education in Australia is one of the most heavily regulated areas. It's incredible the amount of governance that you have to comply with. And that's a trait of Australia in particular. And so we're constantly looking at, what does classical education within an Australian context, what does that look like? How do we achieve the objectives that we want? And so, that's something that we are going to be continuing to work on and to refine as we go along. We've got a lot of help we have a sister school in the US, Chrysostom Academy in Pennsylvania, and the head of that academy, John Heitzenrader, is my mentor, and as a school they've helped us out a lot because they've got 50 years of experience to draw on. But it's not just that school. There are many in the US that are helping us on this journey to help us in that, that process of trying to work out what classical education is going to look like exactly. So that's fundamentally important to our mission and vision.
Closing this interview off, I want to ask you one more question, as I think my audience will be interested in taking some guidance from you. You have walked away from a safe and conventional path and built something incredible, something sacred. What inequalities or practices helped you stay the course?
I have done a lot of prayer on this. And as an Orthodox Christian, our first and foremost priority is prayer. An Orthodox person who doesn't pray is not Orthodox. And my firm belief is that if it's God's will, then He will provide the means and He will provide what's needed. That doesn't mean we don't work. We have to do our work. We work hard, but ultimately we put everything in God's hands. And it's nothing short of a miracle that the school is open and it's running. And so it's not necessarily any... I have to say, though, to be able to do something like this, you do need to be deeply passionate about it. And one of the driving factors for me was, I've got 2 kids and I really want them to receive a good education. That's a big motivating factor. Parents will jump off cliffs for their kids if it's required. And because I could not even conceive of sending my kids back to regular school now that they've been in this environment. And so you have to be very, very passionate. And also the other thing is you need to be able to find people who around you that are just as passionate. Or you have to be able to bring them over to see what really the opportunity that is before them. And I'm yet to meet anybody where I've talked about classical education and they've come to me and said, yeah, not interested. I get the reverse. I've done a lot of presentations on classical education, and I get adults coming to me and saying, I never received a classical education. What do I do? One of the things I would like to see through the academy is that, for example, we start a classical night school. We can't give diplomas or degrees or anything, but I know for a fact that there are many adults out there who would love to be doing further study and to really enrich themselves and to get an education they didn't get. So I think surrounding yourself with the right people, also just getting people in the know, people involved in education who know how things work and who can really assist. But there's that saying, where there is a will, there's a way. And it just depends on whether the will is really strong. And for me, I know that in the lead up, the 2 years leading up, I was praying regular liturgies just for this purpose, and asking for God's help and through a lot of prayer, and a lot of sacrifice. I mean, as you said, I left a very comfortable job, but I think this is one of the most important things in Australian education that is happening right now. We have to reorientate education back to its true purpose, and we have to give children, what I would say is a proper education, not what we're giving them right now.
Father Stephen David, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
That's it. That's all I had for you today. This was Father Stephen David, head of St John of Kronstadt Academy in Brisbane. If you'd like to find out more about the Academy, as always, I've got a bunch of links for you in the show notes. As for more information about classical education, I'd encourage you to listen to the episode I've recorded with Con Bazikos and Jonathan Healy back in October 2024, or more recently, Classical Conversations episode with Cherie Harvey, which I published in April 2025, as this will give you a solid primer on what classical education is and what makes it so incredibly powerful and attractive. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, wherever you may be, and I'll be seeing you next time. Thank you very much for your time today.